Good evening again, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series, now in its 19th season. We are delighted to have with us tonight Eduardo Torres, who's the founder of Pathways for Prevention. I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about him later, but tonight's topic is Understanding Addiction, a community conversation for parents, caregivers, and educators. So we're going to be really delving into substance use and how it impacts our youth and how it impacts us as parents, caregivers, and those of you who are online who are also teachers or educators. If you would like to hear tonight's program in Spanish, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and then Spanish to hear this event in Español. Thank you, Michelle Ramon, for being with us tonight. We also would like to welcome April Torres, who is the Director of Mental Health Programs for the San Mateo Union High School District. And April is one of the sponsors of tonight's event, along with Peninsula Healthcare District. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about her program and how it fits into tonight's offering. Welcome, April.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're really excited to have Eduardo Torres here and sharing all of the knowledge that he has. We are very excited at San Mateo Union High School District to sponsor this event. We believe in educating our youth and empowering them to make better informed decisions. We have programs in our district for substance use, vaping, and other substances through our alternative to suspension programs. So if you would like more information about that, you can always email me at atorres@smush.org. It's atorres@smush.org. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much, April. Always a pleasure to have you with us. So again, most of you by now are familiar with Zoom, but this is a webinar. So I just want to let you know there are two ways for you, the audience, to interact with us. One is the chat button. My co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links in the chat, so do look for that. Eduardo may ask you to put something in the chat, so look for that. And the chat is open, so feel free to talk to one another. We'd like you to put your questions for the presenter in the Q&A box. So chat, resource links in the chat, questions for the presenter, and the Q&A box. Both are open now, so feel free to use them throughout this presentation. Tonight's event is being video recorded and will be available soon on our free video library, which just passed 250,000 views. We know that you are all busy, and for those of you who can't attend synchronously, the library is a way for you to share with a partner or a friend or somebody else in your world, and you can check that out at any time. We partner with the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula to produce our videos. It takes them a couple days, but we really value that partnership. Also, at the very end, you will see pop up a Zoom survey. We hope you'll take 15 seconds and tell us what you thought. That information is important for our funders and also helps us plan for future parent education presentations. All right, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured presenter. Eduardo Torres is the founder of Pathways for Prevention, an organization that delivers substance misuse prevention education around the world. Their prevention specialists educate and empower individuals, families, and communities to make informed choices about their health and well-being. Prior to founding Pathways for Prevention, Eduardo served 12 years as a supervising field officer and senior prevention specialist for Hazelden Betty Ford's Prevention Solutions. His dedication and expertise in the field of prevention earned him high recognition with school communities in 42 countries outside the U.S. When not traveling for work, Eduardo loves spending quality time with his family, along with running. He just completed his first full marathon. Woohoo! Eduardo is fluent in both English and Spanish, allowing him to provide prevention services in both languages. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We're delighted to have with us tonight Eduardo Torres, founder of Pathways for Prevention, and he will be talking to you about Understanding Addiction, a community conversation for parents, caregivers, and educators. Take it away, Eduardo.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charlene, and thank you so much to everyone that's joining us tonight. It's always an honor when I'm asked to present, especially by Charlene and Bev. I do this almost every day of the week, and to this day, every time it's a great feeling to have. And thank you for spending the time with us to get to know a little bit more about addiction. And just, if you at any point have any questions or any thoughts or anything that's on your mind, please, please, please write it in the chat box. We have 1 hour, so I will definitely take some time to answer as many questions as you may have. What I'm hoping for is that when you leave this evening, you will be well equipped to continue holding conversations with your child and also to be much more aware of substance use disorders or substance misuse disorders. So without further ado, I will you present with my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so give me 1 second. Let me just put this. All right, so at Pathways for Prevention, one of the things that we do is we tailor or customize prevention programs to fit the unique needs of every single member of a community, as well as the community in general. We understand that we're using universal prevention-based principles, but we tropicalize the content based on the social determinants of health that may arise in different communities. For example, I spend a lot of my time in Central and South America, which is where I am today serving one of our client schools. And one of the things about folks in Latin America, especially in the communities that we serve, is that according to the survey database, drinking is very, very prevalent. Some of that is mostly guided by, unfortunately, a misconception that alcohol is a relatively benign substance. If something is socially or culturally very acceptable, then it becomes normalized. Furthermore, when something becomes normalized, people eventually lose their perception of risk towards that substance. So the mission of prevention is not necessarily to tell people, don't do drugs, drugs are bad. We know that that doesn't work, but rather to replace those cultural societal norms with evidence, health-based information to empower communities and the members of the community to make informed choices based on their unique risk profile, ranging from the individual, the family, and also the cultural level. And we get there by holding conversations, not presentations. When we think about substance misuse prevention, oftentimes there is a common misconception that some folks may have that they assume that prevention is synonymous with intervention. Some folks have watched shows such as A&E, the show Intervention, and they assume that that's what substance misuse prevention is, but it's not. Substance misuse prevention is founded on the idea and the concept, the theory, we should say, that most kids are actually making healthy choices. So what we want to help them with is for them to continue making healthy, informed choices. Prevention is also fluid. So it's not a binary choice of if you're drinking or if you're using, that's it. You're going to get addicted. But rather it's fluid in the sense that while some kids may drink, what we want to help those kids understand are the inherent risks that they're faced, in the hopes that we can create a little bit of cognitive dissonance for them to probably make healthier choices, or parallel to that at the same time, develop healthier coping strategies, so to speak. And last but not least, yes, tertiary. We want kids that if they are in trouble, that they actually get the help that they need. One of the things that's devastating about substance use disorders is that unfortunately, when a lot of folks are usually diagnosed with substance use disorders, it's usually later in the game, later on in life, talking about the 30s, the 40s. At that point, the brain is no longer as malleable as it is when it's a teenage brain. So we want to help them understand that if they are having issues with substance use disorders, or if they're struggling with a mood altering substance or a compulsive based behavior, asking for help is the first step, and people get a lot better, and the prognosis is significantly increased if young people are intervened on early. This is what prevention entails. At Pathways for Prevention, all of our prevention specialists are in long-term healthy recovery from substance abuse or substance misuse. And so what we do is we use bits and pieces of our heavily curated story to enhance the saliency of our health-based conversation so that it becomes memorable and salient, which is further aligned with prevention's best practices. All right, so what are we actually trying to prevent? Substance use disorders, addiction, chemical dependency, alcoholism, drug addiction. They all have different terms. Some folks say that's alcohol use disorder. Some people say that's substance use disorder. That's chemical dependency. That's addiction. What I want to help you understand is that when people become chemically dependent, there are certain changes that happen in the brain. Some of them can be seen as reversible, others can be seen as irreversible. So I'm going to start off with the first one. When people become chemically dependent, what eventually ends up happening is that there's a desensitizing of pleasure reward systems in the brain. What does this mean? Well, let's talk about the neuromodulator dopamine. Dopamine is such an essential neurotransmitter. Dopamine's main purpose is basically to reward us every time we do something that aids in our survival. People release dopamine when we eat, when we sleep, when we listen to music, on payday, when people have sex. All these things help people release dopamine. So the brain associates dopamine release with staying alive. So the more dopamine is released, people want to do that again. I've heard throughout the years, a couple of our prevention specialists say dopamine is a building habit neurotransmitter, because basically the things that we do and we feel pleasure, we're more likely to repeat. That is the role of dopamine. Throughout any given day, levels of dopamine have a tendency to fluctuate. What do I mean when I say that? They go up and down, but they normally stay centered within what's considered a very, very specific range, like this. This is considered homeostatic, meaning balanced. Let me just give you an example of dopamine fluctuations throughout any given day. For example, I wake up in the morning. I'm not necessarily a morning person, so I wake up over here. But then all of a sudden, I drink my coffee. I have a surge of dopamine. But then I'm tired, but I have to go teach 3 classes. So there's a dip in dopamine. But then I have a great class. There's a surge. But dopamine is centered within this range. When people use mood-altering substances, their brains do something that's unnatural to it, thus interrupting or disrupting levels of dopamine. See, what happens is if someone uses drinks or like, for example, drinks alcohol or uses any other sort of mood altering substance or performs other compulsory based behaviors, because there are other behaviors that are considered addictive behaviors or compulsory based behaviors, levels of dopamine surge, basically crossing that threshold, that roof, so to speak. Consequently, this is unsustainable to the brain. So the next day, instead of being here, further down here, they operate further down here. You do that on a very consistent basis. After a while, it gets to the point where the human brain is no longer able to release dopamine on its own accord. Consequently, it has now become chemically dependent to only releasing a small finite amount of dopamine when the person uses a substance that he, she, they, or them are actually addicted to. That is devastating for a human brain. Think about it. No release of dopamine throughout any given day, lack of concentration, zero motivation, and this feeling of unpleasantness, of not well doing well. So what ends up happening is that when they use a substance, their brains are no longer operating under these parameters of dopamine, which are considered balanced. They're further down here. One of the things that really resonated with me was a while back during the pandemic when I was in El Salvador. That's my home country. That's my country of origin. And one of the things about this was that I'll never forget that I was driving. It was right during the pandemic, and I went to buy fast food. And as I'm driving back home, I got to a red light, and someone knocked on my window. And this person was probably experiencing homelessness. So when they knocked on my window, I put my window down and I looked at this person and I'm like, yes. And they're like, hey, man, can I get a couple dollars from you? And at that point, I thought to myself, I'm like, you know what? I said, I'll do you one better. Here's some food. And this person lost it where they were like, hey, I'm not asking you for food, man. I'm asking you for money. At that point, it dawned on me, and that's what chemical dependency looks like. This is no longer a conscious choice. You see, food, when we're hungry, satisfies a physiological need, and it also increases levels of dopamine. But for that person's brain, their hierarchy of needs has drastically changed. Their brains automatically chose the using the substance over something so basic such as eating, despite the fact that this person probably hadn't eaten in a couple hours or even days. That's how devastating addiction is. So this is where oftentimes some folks may say, well, yeah, but that's that's because, they're not that smart. No, that's because they're addicted. Addiction is a disease. Fortunately, this could be considered a reversible process. People go to rehab, and what they're taught is that they have a disease that's called addiction, substance use disorders, and that their dopamine receptors have been desensitized. So what's recommended is that they practice austerity, that they stop using or stop smoking any of the mood altering substance that they're addicted to, so that their levels of dopamine go back to their preemptive states. How long that takes, there's a lot of variability. Some scientists say a year, other people say up to 2 years. And anecdotally, if you're to ask any person that's been to a rehabilitation facility or any person that's attempted their journey in recovery, many folks will often say that the first and second year were usually the hardest years because they still had this physiological need or this physiological craving to want to use because that was the quickest way of dopamine release. So that's the first thing that happens. Now, the second thing that happens, and this is also very important, is the loss of control. Folks, I am 40 years old. I've been clean and sober for 20 years. I've been free from nicotine for 16 years. If I were to drink or if I were to smoke again, the probability of me being able to control myself is very limited in scope. And let me tell you why that is. We often talk about the adolescent years as being a critical years for brain development. We also understand that the universal risk factor, or the highest risk factor, so to speak, is usually the age of first use. What happens is when there's a loss of control, there are damage to the connections in the brain that mostly transmit information between what's considered the mid part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe. When there is sufficient damage done there, yes, sure, the brain is able to form alternate neural pathways, but it takes information a lot longer to be received between the mid part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which I'll explain in a couple seconds what those things are and what they do. That is the irreversible part about addiction. That is why when folks go into recovery, people are often told that it is in their best interest to abstain one day at a time. Because if they were to drink or if they were to use any sort of mood altering substances, the probability of them being able to control themselves is very, very limited because they're operating under a neurological deficiency. Now, the third thing, which is also something that's very, very important, is the conditioning, the development of maladaptive coping skills. What do I mean when I say that? As I told you, I stopped smoking when I was 24. Smoking cigarettes was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. I didn't know what to do. So the reason why I didn't know what to do was because my brain, ever since I was 14 years old, through the majority of my adolescent years, had always been conditioned that whenever I felt stress, whenever I felt anxiety, whenever I felt anything that disrupted my regular routine of emotions, my brain developed a pathological inclination to use cigarettes or to use a mood altering substance to either quit or stop that negative feeling, being that feeling anxiety, uncomfortability, conflict, or when I felt really good, to elate that feeling. So unfortunately, what did I learn? I learned a maladaptive coping strategy. And we're going to talk about the risk factors, but let me give you a preview of this. Is also in my family history, not only did I have a family history of substance use disorders, but unfortunately, I also had a family history of anxiety. So the first time that I smoked, I felt like my brain calmed down. What the research says is people that have a history of anxiety or that have significant or any sort of mental health issues, they're much more likely to become addicted to nicotine. What I neglected my brain of during the most rapid transition period of a human's life, which is the adolescent years, where the brain is incredibly malleable, I neglected my brain of the ability to develop resiliency. I taught my brain that whenever I felt anything that was uncomfortable or things that felt great, to either increase the feeling or quit it or stop it altogether. I never learned about conflict resolution, and I never developed the art of resilience. Addiction are maladaptive coping patterns. And what we often tell young people is they have an ability to change the narrative if they stop using at a younger age, and to give their brains that opportunity to develop adaptive coping strategies. As you can see, addiction affects every aspect of a person's life. But the good news is that it is 100% preventable. What is the single biggest protective factor against addiction? The first one has everything to do with the age of first use, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. These are the risk factors for addiction. And let me tell you a little bit about the first one, family history. As I told you, I gave you a synapse. In my family, my mom has a significant history of anxiety. When I was growing up, I probably didn't know that. And unfortunately, my father, and my father's side of the family, there is a significant history of alcoholism. My father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. So what ended up happening to me at 14 was the first time that I ever smoked a cigarette. When I first smoked, I felt something that I had never felt before in my life, and that was that I felt like it was calm, that it calmed me down. Parallel to that, I also felt a surge of dopamine. I didn't know it was dopamine at the time, but I felt slightly euphoric. If you folks have a history of anxiety, they're much, much more likely to become chemically dependent to certain substances, one of them being nicotine. Now, let me tell you about alcoholism. You know, in a lot of the schools that we serve, when we are often talking to people, we often tell them about tolerance. Tolerance can be acquired, specifically tolerance to alcohol. But in some cases, tolerance has a genetic component to it. What we find is that folks that have a history of alcoholism, they're naturally born with more liver enzymes that are capable of breaking down and processing alcohol much more efficiently in comparison to people that don't have a family history of addiction, thus increasing their risk of consuming much more alcohol, which in turn increases their risk of chemical dependency and or addiction. Now, parallel to that, when we're also thinking about family history, it's also important to understand a couple of other things that happen. People that have a genetic predisposition to addiction have dopamine hypersensitivity. What do I mean when I say that? Let me tell you now about the first time that I ever drank alcohol in my life. I was 15. It was at a quinceañera birthday party. And me and my best friend drank. And we drank tequila the first time. Now, by having a family history of alcoholism, what happened was that the amount of dopamine that my brain released was higher than the amount of dopamine that my friend probably released, given the fact that he didn't have a family history of addiction. Consequently, if basic laws of gravity state that whatever goes up must come down, but the farther out of range you are from that normal homeostatic balance, the bigger the high, the lower the low. Therefore, the severity of the craving the next day was probably higher for me than it was for my best friend. This is why we tell young people, know your family history. If you don't know if in your family there's a history of addiction, have that conversation with your family. Have that conversation with your relatives. The other part about it is, like I was saying, anxiety, depression, trauma. One of the main reasons as to why a lot of young people use substances, besides the social norms perception, is the fact that they continuously use it to self-medicate, to self-soothe. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that while, yes, they may feel a temporary relief from their mental health issues, it's not as sustainable. Over the long period of time, what eventually ends up happening is that there's a rebound-based effect. What do I mean when I say that? You know, folks, when I started smoking, probably my baseline levels of anxiety were here. After 6 or 7 months of smoking cigarettes, they were probably way higher here. And what I started noticing very, very quickly is that when I wasn't smoking, I felt incredibly anxious. The first month or so, it was like a pink cloud. I felt great. But after 5 or 6 months, I remember that I felt awful. I was like, why am I feeling like this? When I wasn't smoking, when I was in school, I had a harder time concentrating. I felt like my anxiety was higher. The reason why that happens is because there's a desensitizing phase, not just with dopamine, but as well as with other neurotransmitters. Because specifically nicotine, what it does is nicotine is an outlier from most central nervous system stimulants. CNS stimulants produce a predictable result. They increase or they overexcite levels of glutamate, which is an excitatory-based neurotransmitter. But parallel to that, what they also do, what nicotine also does, which makes it that outlier of most central nervous system stimulants, is that it surges levels of endorphins and it suppresses levels of cortisol. That's why you see when people smoke, they appear to be visibly relaxed. But after a long period of time, if cortisol, the stress hormone, for me, baseline was here, after 6 or 7 months, it was here. Therefore, I needed to increase my tolerance, smoke more cigarettes to further decrease it to where it originally was. And after 4 or 5 years, the anxiety levels are a lot higher. That's why you see that folks, when they try to quit smoking, it is one of the hardest things to do. We always tell young people, we tell families, have that conversation with your teens, have that conversation as a family. Empowerment is knowledge, and having that information can definitely be the difference between someone becoming chemically dependent or not. Let me tell you where that information saved my sibling's life. I'm the oldest of 4. And like I said, I am someone that's chemically dependent. I got sent to rehab when I was 19. I'll never forget. This is kind of the silver lining of my addiction. When all of a sudden I sat down in front of my siblings and my parents, and after they did our biopsychosocial profile or analysis, the therapist looked at them and then looked at me. And then she proceeded to ask my siblings, she's like, do you want to be like that guy? Like pointing towards me. And both of my siblings were like, no. All right, then do one thing, delay use. Addiction runs in your family. If you want to avoid being like him, delay use. My siblings, despite the fact that we still have the same family history or genetic predisposition to alcoholism and addiction, they did not become chemically dependent. I did. The difference between me and them is that I started smoking at 14 and I started drinking at 15. My siblings didn't start until they were about 19 and the other one till he was about 23. That's the difference. All right, age of first use, the single biggest risk factor. You see, at prevention, this is not with, oh, never do it because it's bad and it's awful and this, but rather founded on the belief that the longer you delay use, the less probability you have of becoming chemically dependent. Let me explain why. Our brains, an adolescent brain, is very different than an adult brain. What's different about it? They have not yet undergone the process of synaptic pruning. What does this mean? Let's talk about 2 areas of the brain. Let's talk about the midbrain and let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. The midbrain is basically the most primitive part of the human brain. This is where the amygdalas are located, the flight, fight, or fawning-based response. The mid part of the brain, like I said, is basically tasked with survival, raw, instinctive, primitive. As humans, every little bit of sensory-based information that we receive, so what we see, what we hear, and what we feel, is originally processed in the mid part of the brain. What happens afterwards is strictly based on someone's age. So as a young person, that's anywhere between, I don't know, 4 upwards of 10 or 11 years old, the mid part of the brain is somewhat connected to the prefrontal cortex, but it takes a little bit longer for that information to reach from there to here. What is the prefrontal cortex? It's your filter. It's responsible for abstract thinking, future-oriented thinking, higher order logic, moral reasoning. So everything that's sophisticated about the human brain. So what happens between, like I said, between, let's say 4 or 11, between 4 and 11 years old, if you ask, I don't do this anymore because if you want to know the cruel, hard truth about yourself, just ask a 4th or 5th or sometimes even a 6th grader what they think about you. And they'll probably give you an unfiltered response because their prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed and it's not accurately connected. So they're much more impulsive. You see, every little bit of sensory-based information, like I was saying, what we see, what we hear, and what we feel will originally be processed here. When you're a teenager or even as an adult, your brain is already starting to develop in the case of you're a teenager, but if you're an adult, your brain has already developed neural pathways that are mostly connected between here and here. What does this mean? So if you're an adult, if I say, hey, and I do this all the time in my in-person parent meetings, I often pick up an adult out of the room. I'm like, what do you think of me? Adults without failure always say really nice things. Oh, you're nice. You're a presenter, whatever. They gave socially responsive, socially acceptable based responses. But let's talk about how those responses came to be. So when I asked them the question, sensory-based information was received in their midbrain, and shortly thereafter, the midbrain sent that information to the prefrontal cortex, which filtered out the information, and people consequently gave me a socially acceptable response. For that to take place, that's years and years and years, centuries of human evolution, because their brains basically are connected in a microsecond where they're able to send that information, and there's a filtering process that usually occurs. But if you're a teenager, your brain is starting to undergo the process of synaptic pruning. So what does this mean? The way I like to talk about synaptic pruning is using this cord. This is an Apple cord. This has an endpoint. This is obviously connected to the wall. But if I plug this into the wall, basically, I am almost certain that in a second, my phone will start charging. You see, the human brain, from the time we're born to about 11 or 12 years old, the majority of the human brain synapses or neural circuits or connections mostly start and end in what's considered the mid part of the brain, the most primitive part. Why does the brain create neural connections? To automate processes, to conserve energy. Then, at around 11 or 12 years old, the human brain starts to undergo the critical process of synaptic pruning. What does this mean? Degradation of gray matter for an increase in white matter. So the brain will start forming larger, longer neural pathways that are mostly aimed at creating interconnectivity throughout multiple brain regions. Insofar as the connections that matter most in this context of what we're talking about are the connections that are mostly conveyed with sending information between here and also here. Now, those connections need to undergo a process of myelination. Myelination is this protective white coating that you see. What's beneath this are wires that are not yet fully formed or fully developed. So as the brain starts forming these myelin sheets, these neural circuits, it is incredibly sensitive to any sort of abnormal brain surge. You're probably asking, what would be considered an abnormal brain surge? Mood-altering substances, particularly alcohol, which is incredibly neurotoxic to young developers. It's neurotoxic to anyone, but it's particularly much more neurotoxic to young and developing brains. Because what happens is it can create these interruptions, bumps, demyelinating processes, where then all of a sudden, this neural circuit that's conveying information is no longer as effective at sending information between the mid part and the prefrontal cortex. Sure, the brain is incredibly malleable and it will form alternate neural circuits. But the problem is that information between the mid part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex takes a lot longer to hit or to be received. You damage those connections enough, you have a loss of control through the severance of critical neural pathways that were supposed to develop. That's permanent. That's irreversible. That's the loss of control. So if I start drinking again or using any sort of mood-altering substances, despite the fact that I know a lot about substance use disorders and addiction, my cognitive abilities will not be able to override the neurodeficiencies that mostly stem from excessive alcohol, nicotine, and other drug use during my teenage years. This is why we talk to them about delayed use. This is not my personal opinion. These are years and years of research. This is why we tell young people, delay, delay, delay. The other part about it, and now that we're on the topic of alcohol use and alcohol misuse, is that alcohol particularly is considered a central nervous system depressant. So what that means is that when people drink alcohol, it's not necessarily tied with feeling depressed or feeling bad. But unfortunately, when people drink alcohol, they not only have an oversurge of dopamine, so to speak, they also have a significant oversurge in a very critical neurotransmitter, which is called GABA, which is inhibitory in nature. So if you're an adult and you drink alcohol, this is already fully developed. This is already cemented. But if you're a young person, you have exposed wiring. So that abnormal brain surge can further demyelinate these processes Keep in mind that the first thing that a person loses when they're in the process of getting intoxicated is prefrontal cortex-based capabilities. As young people often tell me throughout the world, drunk words are sober thoughts. And what they really mean when they say that is because they lost prefrontal cortex-based capabilities, whatever they think, they're much more likely to act upon, which is 100% true. This is not just relevant to young people, but also to adults. Now, let's talk about what I initially mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which were social norms. This is a big, big, big reason why some young people decide to use. And one of the things that an educator once asked me sometime this semester was, kids know that their alcohol, drugs are bad. They've had education. Why is it that some still do it? It has everything to do with social conformity, social norms. So when we think about social norms, one of the things that's important to realize is that the majority of young people have a tendency to dramatically overestimate alcohol, nicotine, and other drug use by their peers. And at the same time, they underestimate healthy behaviors. So what that does is that it creates a perception gap where there's a significant difference between perception and reality. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from everywhere. They may have an older sibling, they may have social media. So what are they seeing? But it is also human nature to form perception gaps in things that disrupt the norm, because we're much more likely to hear about them. Let me give you an example. I often talk about Boa Paz Flight 2283. May these people rest in peace. That was the Brazilian airplane that crashed. That went viral, that the airplane went down and it circled. It was just awful. When I mention that, I often ask young people, what percentage of airplanes do you think crash? Most of them say 10, 4, 3, as low as 1%. But it's actually a lot lower than that. The reason why they overestimate how many airplanes crash is because, as they say, after we're talking about this and fostering that critical thinking, they're much more likely to hear about the airplanes that crashed versus the airplanes that did their job safely. If I extrapolate that into the current conversation at hand, it's also true that the majority of young people are much more likely to hear about those kids that did drink or used versus the kids that had an uneventful weekend. That's how false normative beliefs are formed. Now, something that's interesting about false normative beliefs and about social conformity is that if you think about the human brain, especially for young people, when they feel that they are deviating from the perceived social norm, there's a part of their brain that's called the medial prefrontal cortex, which has many tasks, but one of the tasks that it has is conflict resolution. So when they feel like that they're an outsider to the perceived norm, the medial prefrontal cortex reports extra activity, as if all of a sudden they feel like they're in a conflict. Whereas when they apparently conform to the perceived social norm, their nucleus accumbens, the part of the brain that's responsible for reward, literally lights up like a Christmas tree. Social conformity is critically important for all humans, but it's especially much more marked and pronounced for younger people. The problem is that there's a discrepancy between perception and reality, further fueled by social media. Our job is to help them understand that this perception gap exists so that they're able to make decisions based on what's happening, not on what they perceive is actually happening. Keep something else in mind. Perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, they're not formed in high school. They're actually formed in middle school. If they have an older sibling, what does anticipatory socialization look like? As well as a whole plethora of things that they can feel like that if they're not part of it, that they're an outsider or out of the norm. Talk to your child about this. This is very important. Explain to them, foster that media literacy piece, which is critically important, especially for this day and age, especially in this context. Because if you don't, unfortunately, if they only see people vaping or smoking or drinking or using Zyn on social media, they're more likely to do that based on the fact that they believe that that is the norm, that that's what the majority of high school students are actually doing. So some of the current trends that we're seeing, unfortunately, while 2023 and 2024 data is finally suggesting that after a big surge of nicotine use in the form of vaping, it's finally starting to level off. But unfortunately, vaping is awful. There's no other way to describe it. And it's also just so predatory how they've marketed to young people. Let me just give you a little bit of insight into this. For starters, first they told young people, cigarettes are really bad, but vaping is actually a safer alternative. So we saw that there was a rotation. Well, young people were no longer smoking, especially Gen Z and Gen Alpha. No. But because they perceived that vaping was a safer alternative, they gravitated towards vaping, all under the misconception that, well, it doesn't give you cancer. But what they also failed to tell young people, it's kind of like cherry picking data, is that, well, yes, it doesn't, there's no research as of yet to support or deny the notion that if you vape, it increases your risk of getting cancer. But what kills a lot of people that smoke traditional cigarettes is heart disease because of nicotine, it being a vasoconstrictor. And something that's predatory in advertising, insofar as electronic cigarettes or vapes are concerned, is that a lot of them say that they only have 5% strength. Sometimes when young people say, yeah, but it only has 5%, they assume that 5% is relatively innocuous, that it means that it's very, very low. Where's the other 95%? This is what's predatory about it, is that they fail to tell young people that that's anywhere between 50 upwards of 59.9 milligrams worth of nicotine, which is significant. So electronic cigarettes or vapes have way, way more nicotine in comparison to traditional cigarettes, so to speak. And this is from Stanford University's tobacco, credit here to Dr. Bonnie Halpern-Felsher, just to quantify just how much nicotine is found in these pods, so to speak. And all of them, without a doubt, say that they only have 5% strength. This is what we need to tell young people. Prevention is not just about pointing to the fact that, oh, this is like, this is how much it has and this is how bad it is, but also encouraging that critical thinking for them to actually feel like they're being deceived, and that rebelling against that deception should be to their advantage, so that they consider not using or doing any of these substances. Now, here's also what's happening. So unfortunately, as I said, nicotine has become very popular amongst young people. And unfortunately also, while yes, vapes are finally starting to decrease, we have seen a significant increase in the use of these oral nicotine pouches called Zyn. Zyn has been able to effectively miniaturize the amount of nicotine that's found in these pouches, so to speak. What do I mean when I say that? So for example, a small pouch of Zyn, which is equivalent to about 6 milligrams worth of nicotine, can be put into the mouth and it's absorbed very quickly into the bloodstream. And it can sometimes metabolize in the body as 9 milligrams, literally the equivalent of smoking 9 cigarettes, so to speak. What we've also seen, this is rather anecdotal, but on TikTok, the hashtag #NicSick, like people getting overdosing on nicotine, things that we normally wouldn't see necessarily with electronic cigarettes or vapes, so to speak. This is becoming much more popularized, and they're using the same harm reduction strategy or model. What do I mean when I say that? Well, first they told young people cigarettes are safe, smoke them. But then they said, cigarettes are bad, but vapes are safer. Now they're saying, well, cigarettes are bad. We know that vapes are bad, but actually Zyn is a safer alternative because you're not hurting your lungs. Once more, cherry picking data. And unfortunately, a lot of these companies have one thing in common, that they own stake in these oral nicotine pouches. They also hold stake in electronic vapes, and they also own cigarette companies, traditional cigarette companies. So this is incredibly predatory, and it's mostly designed to get young people to use their products because they know that the unique vulnerability of the adolescent brain significantly increases the likelihood that if they are exposed to nicotine, they'll probably end up becoming chemically dependent to it relatively quickly. So that's the other part about this. Now, something else that's trending, and this usually has it baffles me just because there was a viral video that went viral where someone used galaxy gas and they inhaled it, and it altered the tone of their voice, and all of a sudden it's a thing now. But unfortunately, it is riding the tidal wave of vapes. What I mean when I say that is that these products are now found in some vape stores. This is galaxy gas, which is basically nitrous oxide. So just a couple things about nitrous oxide. A regular whipped cream can has about 6.5 grams of nitrous oxide. Galaxy gas cans have 2,000 grams, and they are incredibly,
Eduardo,
incredible.
can you hear me? Looks like you might
Yes.
be frozen.
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, now we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Charlene, where did I leave off? Sorry.
We were just talking about nitrous oxide.
Okay. All right, so sorry about that. So when we're talking about galaxy gas, this is nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is a mild form of an anesthetic. So when you go into the dentist's office, sometimes you're given this, and it's called galaxy gas. It's called laughing gas for a reason, because you feel relatively relaxed and relatively you laugh about things because it's a central nervous system depressant. So it's inhibitory, so to speak. Excessive amounts of nitrous oxide can sometimes damage your central nervous system, particularly also your body's ability to produce vitamin B12, which in turn could create demyelinating processes or cannot in a way help the body maintain myelination, so to speak. So unfortunately, in some cases, what a lot of things that are being seen in people that are using this very, very frequently is that all of a sudden they experience this muscle weakness where sometimes they're not even able to lift up their limbs. So this is an incredibly dangerous substance, and unfortunately, it's being normalized. And one of the things that's important to know is that any form of normalization decreases the perception of risk towards that substance. So I want to bring this to your attention because this is something that, without a doubt, in all schools that I've been to across the world and in the United States, this is a question that young people as early as 7th or 8th grade are usually asking. What do you know about galaxy gas? And they see it as a laughing stock, and they're easily accessible. What we know too about accessibility is that it also increases the probability of using. And last but not least, alcohol. One of the things that, and I'll open this up for questions right after. This is the most commonly used substance. This is usually how a lot of young people start. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries all over the world and also in the United States, sometimes we can perceive alcohol to not be as harmful as other drugs. What's important to note in this context is that, yes, some drugs have a probability of getting you addicted more so based on prevalence of first-time use than other drugs. But unfortunately, what most people don't realize is that parental permissiveness around alcohol increases the likelihood that when a young person drinks alcohol, they're much more likely to use it excessively, so to speak. Alcohol is a very powerful central nervous system depressant. If we look at substances that are considered addictive, we're talking about two: CNS depressants and central nervous system stimulants. What they have in common is that they both work by desensitizing dopamine receptors in the brain. Where they differ, specifically with alcohol, is that alcohol, on top of increasing levels of dopamine, it also significantly increases or neuroexcites GABA receptors in the brain, which create an inhibitory-based response. What does this mean? When the human brain recognizes that there is a foreign invader that's trying to make it go unconscious, such as alcohol, it triggers a plethora of physiological responses so that the brain and the body is able to survive or withstand that oversurge of GABA. What does it do? It makes sure that the autonomous central nervous system, which is located back here, is functioning. This is what controls everything that's involuntary. But unfortunately, the first thing that people lose when they're starting to get intoxicated under the influence of alcohol is prefrontal cortex-based capability. This is the rational part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that says, don't do that. Furthermore, if they keep drinking, they also lose their amygdala, the part of the brain that assesses risk spot on. So when you lose those two speed brakes, or those two brakes that are designed to keep us safe, whatever thought you get or whatever impulse you get, you're much more likely to act on it. So this isn't just about addiction. The probability of getting hurt or injured, getting in a motor vehicle after you've been drinking, getting riding as a passenger with someone that's been drinking, getting involved in sexual situations, using other drugs. Keep in mind one thing, statistically speaking, people that consume large amounts of alcohol in a very short amount of time, what I mean when I say that is people that binge drink, defined as consuming 4 or 5 alcoholic beverages within a 2 or 3 hour window, are much more likely to also be polysubstance users. So some parents may have the misconception that, oh, I'm just going to teach my kid how to drink so that they don't do other drugs. Well, what the research says is that that's actually not true. That unfortunately, if they are higher risk drinkers, they're much more likely to also experience with other substances. The other part about it is the immediate consequences that may happen. Any of these things could significantly derail the outcome of a young person's life. Getting hurt or injured, getting involved in a sexual situation, riding as a passenger of someone that's been drinking, driving drunk, all of these things, which could in a way derail the outcome of a young person's life. So talk to your child about alcohol. If they're in 11th or 12th grade and if they've already started drinking, what I've often heard a lot of young people tell me is when I ask them, what do your parents say about drinking? Moderation. But folks, moderation for a young person is different than moderation for an adult. Have that conversation if you still believe that that is an acceptable risk. Remember, the age of first use is by far the single biggest predictor for substance use disorders. What prevention aims to do is empower you as parents and young people to delay the use of any sort of mood-altering substance as much as they possibly can to decrease the risk of becoming chemically dependent. But it's also of critical relevance to know and understand your family history so that in a way you're able to make better health-based decisions with this information. With that, I know we only have about 8 minutes, so I will stop my share and I'll actually answer any questions that you may have.
All right, Eduardo, thank you. That was amazing. That was amazing. I've heard you lots of times. I learned a lot more tonight. Really
Thank you.
clear, really important. So not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions coming in, and a lot of people are asking, do these rules and constructs that you've been talking about apply if your child is addicted to technology, to their phone, to a video game, to gaming? What is your stance on that?
Thank you. So yes, what has also been shown is that especially there's a difference. One of the things that I didn't mention, Bev, and that I should have is process addictions. Specifically, one of the things that we're seeing tonight, that we're seeing across the world and also in the United States and anywhere around the world, is the rise of online gambling.
Mm,
This, Charlene, is a significant problem because the pathology of pathological gambling is one of the most difficult, insidious addictions without necessarily having to put a chemical into your body. And it also is categorized by the folks that end up becoming addicted to gambling in any sort of form, is that they also develop a tolerance. It is basically described as the perfect addiction because as the person is waging a bet, they feel a surge of adrenaline, norepinephrine, as well as dopamine. And after they've waged the bet, they feel a surge of serotonin, oxytocin, and at the same time, endorphins and dopamine. So this is also very, very concerning. And unfortunately, parental perceptions around online gambling, oh, it's just for $5. No. Again, we go back to the premise of the younger you are, the higher the risk you have of becoming chemically dependent. Now, moving on to tech devices, it is critically important to regulate technology devices. Not all screen time is created equal, but games of chance, games where gamers, so to speak, there are certain personality types that basically are starting to mold and look very similar to folks that may have a history of impulse control disorder, which when we think about substance use disorders, before it was labeled substance use disorders or addiction, it was kind of seen as an impulse control disorder. A lot of internet gaming or online gaming, the personality types resemble that, where they have a harder time being able to control themselves. They're much more impulsive, so to speak, and they also spend a considerable more time being able to do that. What also is seen is that especially for folks that have ADHD, while some people may say, well, but when they use it, they can concentrate super well, but then when they go to school, they don't. Yes, because they are becoming chemically dependent to only having high levels of dopamine as well as adrenaline to be able to focus and concentrate. So when they go to school and they're not entertained and it doesn't involve a game of chance or whatnot, they have a harder time staying concentrated. So it aggravates their neurodivergence, such as ADHD, so to speak,
So,
especially.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted
No,
you.
no, no. I was just going to say, especially when they're games of chance, like the Roadblocks, Fortnite, all of these games that have become very, very popular.
I mean, anybody who's tried to get a 9-year-old boy off of video gaming, it sure feels like they're addicted. The meltdowns. I mean, is that true addiction? You're saying that there is a chemical dependency that can happen with your daughter on social media or your son on that game?
There is a surge of dopamine. It doesn't it teeters on on kind of like the roof. It doesn't necessarily go way, way higher as well
Okay.
as what you would see with pathological gambling, but some form of video games have been shown to significantly increase levels of dopamine that would basically be categorized as addiction, so to speak.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
We have a lot of good questions. Let's see how fast we can go here. You touched on this. What is the right age to share with my child our family history of addiction?
Great, great question. Love that question. Charlene, what I would definitely say is that to start having those conversations early and not necessarily frame it in the context of, oh, you're going to get addicted, but for them to understand that addiction runs in the family so that it's especially important for them to try to further delay any sort of use as much as they can. Those conversations early in their preteen years so that they're aware of the fact that that is a relevant risk factor. We talk to our kids if they have a family history of diabetes or heart disease about making healthy choices. The younger it starts, the much better equipped the much better equipped they are at being able to make informed choices. And also, Charlene, which is also very important and something that I always tell parents, practice saying no with them. We often assume that young people will know how to say no, but that's an acquirable skill that we can teach them, that we can mold them into being able to feel comfortable saying no and standing up for themselves. So when that time comes, they're armed with information about their family history, their family background, and at the same time, they're very well equipped to be able to instinctively say no.
And parents, as Eduardo is saying, this is where you can be the heavy in a way that's helpful. At a party, if your kid knows to say, oh, my mom would kill me, I just don't drink, or I'm going to be getting a ride home at whatever time, you can be that person and you can practice that with your kids ahead. All right, couple more, Eduardo. These are all such good questions.
Yes, of course.
Um, how can we help our students who refuse professional help and continue to abuse substances? I know that's a hard one to answer quickly.
You know, one of the things that we often tell young people, especially when they're staging interventions with with someone that's young that doesn't want help, is that in a lot of cases the purpose of the intervention is simply to create a little bit of cognitive dissonance and to often here's what I mean by this, Charlene. Let's say, Charlene, that you know me and I know you, and I'm a young person and you're my teacher, and you tell me that I have a problem with drugs. And what I'll say back to you most likely is, no, I don't. I'm fine. If you dig deeper, what I'll say is, hey, it helps me relieve my anxiety, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's the consequence in it of itself. But what oftentimes happens with young people is that they see that their consequences are fragmented or are not part of their substance use, so to speak. What I mean when I say that is oftentimes when we go up to young people and say, so why are you reaching out? Like what, like, did you get caught vaping? Yeah, but I'm not addicted or whatnot. Because, or, and then when you dig deeper, they're most often likely than not to say, well, I I maybe have an issue or whatnot, but it helps me with my anxiety. This is where the pros and cons exercise and contemplating the stages of change, this is all part of cognitive behavioral therapy, is usually the first step without telling them that they necessarily have a problem. So the first step is when you're staging an intervention is to point out the behavior, point out what you're seeing as the consequence, and then go like leave them be. what will most often happen is that they'll think about it. And consistently, when everyone is telling them the same thing, that's usually when the person starts to think that they have a problem. But it starts with, in a way, just pointing out the problem, pulling on their heartstrings because you care, and then leaving them be and offering them a solution or an alternative. In many cases, they'll say, no, 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 don't worry about it. I'm not in trouble, or I'm good, I'm good. But most oftentimes, sooner rather than later, they may realize or come to the realization that they do have a problem. The hardest part about those interventions is walking away, feeling like you didn't achieve or solve anything. That's the hardest part about this. But trust me when I say that that works. Those are these hallway interventions that are critical and that do have the power of changing lives, so to speak. What we know doesn't work is telling them that they have a problem.
All
It's
right.
different when you point them to them and say, "Hey, I'm worried about your behavior. Is everything okay?" You're now shifting the focus from this punitive bad to a health-based concern. And that's the first step. And then, is there anything I can do to help you? I've seen this behavior. Is everything okay? No, I'm fine. Don't worry about. Okay. And then at the same time, when you consistently talk to them is, so what do you enjoy about it? Oftentimes they're like, what? Like, what do you enjoy about vaping? Oh, it helps me with my anxiety. And how long have you been vaping? A year. Was your anxiety, is it better today when you're not using it than it was a year ago? That's where that cognitive dissonance starts. But in a way, it's unpacking that conversation. We often tell young people, communities around the world, let's normalize the conversations about substance use and substance misuse, as well as the correlates of substance abuse and substance misuse.
Thank you, Eduardo. So
Mhm.
we have come to the end of our hour, but I want to say thank you, everybody, for being here, and Eduardo for this wonderful presentation. So many comments in the chat. People are so appreciative. And yes, this event is being video recorded and will be available soon for free on our video library. Also, you can go to Eduardo's website, pathwaysforprevention. What is it, Eduardo?
.com. Yeah. Yep.
.com. Okay, pathwaysforprevention.com. He also mentioned Dr. Bonnie Halpern Fellowship from Stanford and Reach Lab. You can go to the Reach Lab website. There's a whole parent corner and a section for teens who are trying to get off of substances. So those are both great resources for you. Eduardo, I want to give you the last 30 seconds, just final words for us tonight before we part. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Charlene, and thank you, Bev, as well. Thank you, Michelle, for the translation. Thank you, April, for sponsoring this, and thank you, parents, for spending an hour with us. Just remember, have those conversations with your kids. One of the things that I always want to empower parents with is you are the most important protective factor in your kids' lives. Have those conversations. Be there for your child. Prevention is proactive, not reactive. And with that, thank you so much.
And thank you, April. Thank you for your sponsorship, Peninsula Healthcare District and San Mateo Union High School District. Take care, everybody. Thank you,
Thank
Eduardo.
you.
Take
Bye,
a few
folks.
seconds, everybody, to fill out that survey. Bye for now.
Bye.